Hello, today is Wednesday, April 18th, 2007. My name is Mark Depew. I'm the Director of Oral History for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. We're here for the second time, Dave, with you to pick up where we left off and talking about your experiences with the Iraqi High Tribunal. So what we would like to do is kind of replicate just a little bit of what we were talking about last time, but go back and a little bit more discussion about the Iraqi High Tribunal. And specifically, I think my questions are of the nature of why that particular format versus the model that had been in existence for Kosovo and others, a much more deliberative process where the United Nations was involved. Why did the Iraqi High Tribunal get set up the way it did?
Well, partly because there really wasn't any other option. Literally. The special tribunals in Yugoslavia and Sierra Leone were set up by the United Nations, and the United Nations didn't support the invasion of Iraq, and the Secretary General of the United Nations even said there is no international tribunal with jurisdiction over crimes against humanity, genocide, etc., committed by Saddam Hussein. A tribunal would have to be created to do that. The International Criminal Court existed, but only had jurisdiction for crimes that occurred after its creation. And the crimes committed by Saddam were, for the most part, before that. Mm-hmm. So even the International Criminal Court was not an option. And my observation, the death penalty had a lot of weight in that decision. If in any of the courts that would be created under the auspices of the United Nations, by virtue of the majority view of the United Nations, death penalty would not be an option. That made that unacceptable to the Iraqis. Now, I'm speaking my own personal observations. I'm not speaking as an official representative of the United States government or of the Department of Justice in this or anything else that I say, but it's my observation that the Americans have a strong preference toward domestic courts as the first, as the default setting, so to speak, for a tribunal of this sort.
When you say domestic, you mean Iraqi domestic court?
Whatever country, and in this case it would be Iraqi.
Right.
Just as we would want our own courts to try anyone who perpetrated enormous crimes against the people of the United States, we would presume, and I think actually the international community in general presumes a deference toward domestic courts.
In general, but apparently there is a significant number of people in the international community who thought the Iraqis were not up to this?
Well, I'm not sure that any particular domestic body would be up to initially, without considerable spinning up and support, a task of this magnitude. There aren't very many domestic courts that are set up to try genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, things of that sort. These are almost invariably, with crimes of this magnitude, some sort of special tribunal that's set up. Now, there's an option of having a hybrid of a domestic and international court, which is sometimes done. There's the option of a purely international court. But if the Iraqi people, ultimately the decision about who should try Saddam Hussein or any dictator like Saddam Hussein for crimes against his people ought to be made by the victims of those crimes themselves, those people. What right would the international community have to come in and impose upon the people of Iraq a trial through a tribunal not of their own choosing, to which they oppose? Ultimately, we deferred to the Iraqis, and the Iraqis, as I understand it, I wasn't there myself, but I've heard numerous times from those who were from the beginning insistent that Saddam Hussein be held accountable to the Iraqi people by Iraqi judges in an Iraqi court. So literally, it really was the only viable option.
I'm sorry to keep going back to this, but the answer was quite different for Yugoslavia. Is because the the Yugoslav people, being such a diverse ethnic group, didn't have a problem with surrendering some of that authority to a UN body?
Well, I really am not an expert.
Okay.
I was not involved in that area. I think that that presented a completely different situation because there were so many different. Yugoslavia disintegrated. The former Yugoslavia disintegrated, and which of these different political bodies would host that court?
Okay.
There
Good
were
point.
multiple countries that were involved. The United Nations was very much involved in the effort in the former Yugoslavia, and consequently what was established there was in a very different political and factual setting than the situation in Iraq.
Would it be fair to say, though, that the people you were working with, both the Iraqis and the Americans, during your experience, though, felt strongly that their model worked better than the UN model for the former Yugoslavia?
I don't know that you'd say better. There were a great many similarities in the laws and in procedures. What was different and made things work, made things more challenging in the Iraqi situation is that there were far fewer resources. I've talked to people who were involved in the international tribunals in the former Yugoslavia or for the former Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. Huge amounts of money and resources, translators, advisors, large staff, facilities.
I've seen the pictures of the building the UN used for the former Yugoslavia. Says, wow, a nice place.
Well, the Iraqis were laboring under a situation where the challenge was huge and the resources were only a fraction of that. Literally, in many respects, I have more resources back here in the United States, in Springfield, Illinois, investigating a major drug conspiracy case or something of that sort than we had there. Now, that's not always. There are some instances where, because of the military involvement, for example, in the translation of documents, culling through the tons of documents that were seized during and after the invasion, that there were huge resources involved. But in terms of the operation of the court itself and our particular unit, the Regime Crimes Liaison Office, the RCLO, we just really had only a small fraction of what's available to those United Nations funded tribunals.
Okay, let me get you back to some more familiar turf for you. Describe a little bit about the specific relationship the Regime's Crime Liaison Office had with the Iraqi High Tribunal, how that worked out.
Well, we were advisors. Early on, before I got there, the RCLO arranged training for the Iraqi judges. They had
the RCLO is strictly an American operation?
No.
Okay.
The RCLO included representatives from other countries. Well, the RCLO had those who were providing training came from different countries. One of the training sessions was held in England, one was held in Italy. They brought in people to train the judges from all around the globe. The RCLO acted as a conduit for hiring, for the funding of a Canadian who was the advisor, legal advisor to the defense attorneys. We didn't supervise him, but the money came through the RCLO budget. There was also, separate from the RCLO, a British advisor to the judges who had been one of those who had trained them initially and then was on scene working with them as an advisor behind the scenes, someone to whom they could turn with vast experience with other international tribunals and with the law, and
so
provide a British perspective, not an American perspective.
But the RCLO was strictly other countries that were involved.
RCLO was run by the Americans and was definitely, for the most part, American. But I had a British war crimes investigator assigned working with me, with whom he and I were partners.
Were there any other Arab countries involved with that?
Yes, we had Americans who were from Arab countries, who were naturalized. They had been born in Arab countries, grew up in Arab countries, but had been naturalized and had obtained the necessary security clearances to be hired on a contract basis by the RCLO. So they were still American, but they were also Arab.
So they at least knew the Arab language, the Arab culture. They were immersed in those things, which obviously the average American from the middle of Springfield, Illinois, wouldn't necessarily have those skills.
We had a member of the staff who was a naturalized Iraqi, who was a lawyer, an Iraqi lawyer, who actually fled from Saddam and Saddam's regime to the United States, was naturalized in the United States. His family eventually came over and joined him. But he came back after the invasion and was an advisor on a contract basis to the RCLO and was an immense resource to us. We had a Kurdish, British Kurdish citizen, again, dual Iraqi, British citizen who was on the staff and was an investigative advisor who assisted us. So there was an international flavor to the RCLO, but for the most part, it was run by the Department of Justice and under the auspices of the Department of State. And we try as we might to get other countries to be involved in that effort. We're largely unsuccessful in accomplishing that.
Okay.
They were willing to assist with training to a certain extent, but wouldn't get involved any more than that.
And they probably had criticisms here and there.
They were very liberal in their criticisms and almost totally unsupportive in doing anything that would actually be of practical value in satisfying those criticisms.
Now, the relationship between the Iraqi High Tribunal and the RCLO, the RCLO would obviously offer advice, lots of training, things like that, but who ultimately was calling the shots on this?
Well, the Iraqis. I can guarantee you, we were only advising. Now, we had control over the prisoners, and so we could deliver them or not deliver them, depending on whether conditions of fairness and security were met. But in terms of the actual operation of the court, we could only advise the judges. And there were numerous instances over and over and over again. I won't go into all those when the advice that we gave or the preferences that we had were overruled by the court, and a lot of times appropriately so, many times appropriately so. Sometimes we felt not as appropriately so, but always the judges were the ones who made the decisions.
How would you characterize then in a few words the relationship, the nature of the relationship between the Iraqi High Tribunal and the RCLO? Was it contentious? Was it cooperative? What term would you describe it with?
Well, it was certainly cooperative. At times, there could be contentious, I suppose, not in the sense of anger, but the Iraqis didn't always see things the way we did. Again, sometimes that's because we did not understand their legal system sufficiently to understand that we were asking them to do something that was really foreign to them and that really might not fit well in their legal system. On the other hand, they recognized that they couldn't conduct these proceedings like a normal Iraqi criminal proceeding because, as we talked about in our last session, normally the witnesses testify only during the investigative stage, and rarely is there witness testimony during the trial stage. This needed to be a trial that the whole world would see. A decision was made very early that this would be as transparent as possible, the proceedings in court, and that the whole world would be able to watch. Well, if the world only watched the reading of depositions from witnesses who had testified earlier, that would really defeat that transparency purpose. So there was a bit of the kind of Anglo-American style of doing trials by calling witnesses. Now, who's going to ask questions? Who's going to present the documents? All of that. Normally, and what they did, the judge asks questions. But what about the presentation of documentary evidence? Who would do that? they had to work out whether the judge does it, because it's actually the judge's evidence, it's in the judge's file,
Yeah.
or whether the prosecutor would do it. Ultimately, they decided the prosecutor would do that. That's a new role. That's foreign to their system, that the prosecutor would play such a quasi-adversarial role in the proceedings. And so there were some serious discussions that went back and forth. The idea of conflict of interest, other procedural things that we have, really were foreign somewhat to them, because the judge is the one who's responsible for looking after the interests of the defendant as well as the public and the interests of justice. So we had some serious discussions, and there was a give and take on both sides.
Did you ever get any sense of resentment that the Iraqis had towards the Americans and others who were offering this advice, who didn't seem to be getting it when it was explained to them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, definitely. There were a number of points of friction, but I think we worked through those, sometimes better than others. But I think we had a good relationship with them. But those people that I continually read about, people criticizing the court as somehow being puppets of the Americans, that's just that's humorous to the point of being laughable to those of us who were there.
Yeah.
The Iraqis were anything but puppets. There's one thing about judges, no matter where you go in the world, they wear the robe. And when the curtain went up, they controlled what went on in the courtroom.
So it's fair to say that everybody on both sides are human beings, and sometimes disagreements come about, but everybody managed to work through it?
Sure. I mean, you're talking about judges and lawyers.
Yeah.
Working, whether it be in this country or in Iraq, you're just not going to agree on things. But we work things through and things move forward. But this really was, this is an important point, an Iraqi court. And it was really headstrong, strong-willed, and competent Iraqi judges who proceeded forward their way. It was an Iraqi court, not an American court,
Yeah.
not a kangaroo court that the Americans set up as a show or something of that sort.
Regardless of what we might be reading in the media sometimes, or hearing in the media.
People who weren't there had lots of opinions. Let's just put it that way.
And agendas to go along with the opinions, perhaps. What I'd like to do now is change gears a little bit and have you talk about your experiences with the Marsh Arabs. And I think we're going to start with a map that we can go to here for just a couple seconds. And you can talk us through that, and then talk a little bit about the culture and the heritage and the history of the Marsh Arabs.
Well, the Marshes covered a large area in the southeast corner of Iraq.
Okay.
Really, if you were to make a triangle from Basra, which is right down in the southeast corner, up to head north along a little bit to the west of the border with Iran,
Okay.
to Amara, and then head west, kind of halfway in between those, to Nasiriyah. That triangle would be the area that encompassed most of the marshes.
Is that between the Tigris and Euphrates, or?
Well, the marshes really extended initially east of the Tigris. It's really, the marshes were formed where the Tigris and Euphrates overflowed. It's a very flat area. If you think Illinois is flat,
Yeah.
the southeastern part of Iraq is even flatter. And in that area, the Tigris and the Euphrates would overflow their banks, and that created the marshes. Now there were spring floods, and that would expand the area of the marshes, and then they would recede. There were some permanent marshes, and then there were the kind of expand and contract areas of the marshes.
Now,
But it covered a lot of area.
If you were to compare this with something we might understand in the United States, what would be the size or the scale of the marshes before Saddam tried to start draining them?
You know, that's a good question. I've read how many square miles that is. It's tens of thousands, but I don't really recall how large that is.
But anyway, tens of thousands of square miles is a huge geographical area.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It is.
And a little bit about the culture and the history of the area then.
Well, in these marshes, as near as we can tell from historical records, existed thousands and thousands of years ago, clear back in the days of Abraham. Was the scriptural record speaks of him being born in Ur, later Ur of the Chaldees, which was apparently on the edges of the marshes. Babylon was in that area. This was what's sometimes referred to as, the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization. There were great civilizations that existed, and the marshes were on the edges of that. The marsh people had a civilization that was aquatic, really.
Yeah.
There was no.
We can go to a couple pictures, maybe that can help us get a feel for it too.
They built buildings out of the reeds that were available, sometimes very large buildings. I think we're looking at one of those now from a photograph that was taken from a book in the 1950s that shows a large kind of community building, and it's built on solid ground. Now, many of the structures that they build, their homes, were built in areas where there was no solid ground. It's just marshes. It's wetland. And so what they would do is build man-made islands and build their homes on those islands out of reed homes. And there were stone reliefs that have been left by the ancient Sumerians 3,500 years ago that have pictures of those reed homes, reed huts and homes and structures that look identical to what the Marsh Arabs today would build. And they would get from one house to another in canoes. And these canoe-like structures today look identical, many of them, to a silver model that was found in the ruins of Ur of the Chaldees about 5,000 years ago.
And so the picture we're seeing here is a good example of what that would look like.
Well, this one doesn't have quite the high prow of the chiefs, tribal chiefs canoe, like it would be consistent with that silver model I just mentioned. But yes, it's exactly the same type of canoe type structure that's depicted in these relics from ancient civilizations. That and other archaeological and literary evidence suggests strongly that the Marsh Arab culture existed for literally millennia, at least 3,500, 5,000 years, and who knows how far before that. Well before there was such a thing as Arabs. We call them Marsh Arabs because they adopted the Arab culture, the culture of the Bedouins, and they lived in the marshes, hence Marsh Arabs. But the people had lived there with a primitive lifestyle and culture that had endured despite its primitive nature for millennia, which when we think about how long our country has been in existence and our chances of our culture without change continuing to live, there's a great deal to be admired by any culture that can survive that long.
10 years seems like forever in the United States, and it's just a blink in the eye for these people.
That's right.
This is a subsistence culture?
It's a subsistence level economy. It was difficult. It's a wilderness area. And so the people, they lived, one of the mainstays of their lifestyle were water buffalo, fishing. They grew rice, things of that sort. The water buffalo provided milk that was used for yogurt. Also, the manure was used for fuel. The water buffalo played a role to the Marsh Arabs much like the camel would to the Bedouins. Fish, I asked the judge that I worked with, whose ancestors were from the marshes, well, Judge, what do Marsh Arabs have for breakfast? And he said, well, probably fish. I said, how about lunch? What would they have for lunch? Fish. Well, how about supper? What would they have for dinner? Fish. So if you're Marsh Arab, you better like fish, which you can imagine in that area. They also would hunt waterfowl. There were some huge boars that they would sometimes hunt that had been in that area. But this was not Baghdad. This was not the big city. This was a primitive area. And so the people lived out their lives trying to eke out a living from this environment.
And it sounds to me like they took a great amount of pride in living that lifestyle. They had no desire to be anything other than who they were.
Apparently, because they could have. They had Basra, they had Nasiriyah, Amara, big cities that were right on the edges of the marshes, but they didn't go there.
How about the religion?
Well, for the most part, well, they were Muslim, but for the most part Shia Muslim, although there were other religions that were in there, including some that had their roots in Christianity or other religions that had survived, but for the most part, Shia Muslim.
So these are people who had been influenced by other cultures, by other religions and things like that, but they had always managed to adapt it to their particular lifestyle living in the marshes.
Right. They're very, very much tribal. Their government, their structure of their society was tribal. Now the tribes had conflicts with one another, and tribal conflicts even to this day account for one of the major causes of deaths among the Marsh Arabs.
Even in the best of times.
Even in the best of times. And that's not just true of the Marsh Arabs. Tribal Iraq itself is largely based on a tribal culture.
Now you say it's a tribal culture, and then we saw pictures of the marshes, and it looks like almost the entire area is covered. You said that they would actually almost build up areas to build their houses on. Did they have entire villages like that, or did they? How did the people? Did they live closely together in villages?
Well, in the villages they were close together, but the villages would be quite some distance usually from each other. But there were literally hundreds of villages in the marshes. It was difficult to come up with a population figure for the marshes as a whole, because these people being in a primitive area, there were no census takers going house to house. They'd had the best people have been able to come up with is a figure that's somewhere roughly between 250,000, 250,000 to 500,000, and the figure that's most commonly cited is about 400,000 as the total population of the Marsh Arabs in the marshes before the attacks by Saddam.
So that's a substantial population.
It's a very large population.
And I guess I saw a picture, and what struck me looking at the picture of a village, an overhead shot of the village, is you've got these houses that are built up on dry land, but each house is surrounded by water, so that the houses would be separated. You'd have to take a canoe practically just to see your neighbor.
Not practically, that's exactly what they would do.
Okay.
That's exactly what they would do. The houses, I even heard stories of houses that in the morning with the wind and all would have turned and might be facing a different direction than they were when they went to bed. To make these islands, they would drive reeds, as I understand it, down into the mud and make a corral and then fill it with mud and other reeds and keep building a platform. They'd keep adding to that as it would sink, and they would build the reed home on top of it. I've seen them from the air, some, but I've never had the opportunity because of the security situation, or the lack of security situation, to actually visit the villages, but I really hope to do that someday.
Okay, so that takes us back to you and your involvement with the Marsh Arabs. How did it happen that you particularly got assigned to investigate this part of Saddam's crimes?
Well, that was an assignment that was made after I arrived and reported for duty at the RCLO and the U.S. Embassy there in Baghdad. I was there a couple of days, and the deputy chief of the RCLO divvied out the assignments. And I was fortunate enough to get what I consider to be the choicest of those assignments. All of the assignments were important. All of the investigations that we were supporting were important. But for me, I came to love the Marsh Arabs, and to be of service to them was a great honor.
How many others were assigned to that?
Just me.
You were the only one of the RCLO?
Initially. Later, for a period of time, for a few months, I had a second attorney, an attorney actually, appropriately enough, from the Environmental Crimes section of the Department of Justice, was assigned to work. But he then later began assisting with other investigations and ultimately became the deputy chief of the RCLO. And then I was back as the sole attorney. And this is one of the things I was saying. You had, now picture this, you have crimes of the magnitude of genocide, certainly crimes against humanity, with hundreds of thousands of victims under in a war zone, an investigation being conducted in a war zone after an invasion. And we had one attorney from the United States assigned to support the judge. We had one Iraqi judge. He had two investigators who worked with him on a regular, one really that worked with him on a regular basis, others that he drew upon. And we had FBI agents, started 2 agents when I first arrived, later just 1, and those agents would rotate every 3 months. And we're supposed to put all this together to present to a body of a world full of critics.
Thus your comment about the local office here in Springfield for the U.S. Attorney is better equipped and manned and
absolutely, absolutely. It was an enormous challenge.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the nature of the crimes themselves, and I know you've got a couple pictures that illustrate that as well, because we've glossed over that up to this point. What happened? Why was this worthy of being investigated in the first place?
Well, what happened was that...
Get the picture up, if we could, please.
The Marsh area was an area that was very difficult for Saddam or any other regime to control. And it, in some respects, had a reputation a little bit like Sherwood Forest. You know, it was an area where deserters and criminals might flee for refuge. And the Marsh Arabs were traditionally a very hospitable people, as are the Arab people in general. And so they would provide them refuge, support, not because necessarily of sympathy, but just because out of hospitality.
That's part of the Arab culture, is it is expected that if a guest arrives, you're supposed to treat that guest in a very special way?
That's correct.
Okay.
And they did. Now, so the Marshes were a problem, but for a period before the 1990s, for a period of time, the regime had considered draining sections of the marshes. But those projects really had faltered and didn't get very far. Then during the period of time in the 80s, during the Iran-Iraq War, the regime under Saddam drained a portion of the marshes to the east of the Tigris, long maybe 50, 70 miles wide, along the border with Iran, to form a buffer zone between the Iranian border and the marshes, so that they could prevent infiltration of agents coming across from the Iranian border. What they did was they built dikes or levees along the east side of the Tigris, and I think we have a photograph right up here now.
That shows it very well.
Right, and on one side of that you'd have marshes, and on the other side you'd have desert, and that really continues to exist today. And they displaced all of the people. There was a military basis for doing that. The manner in which they did it was brutal.
Now, you say the military bases. This started along the border between Iran and Iraq. That was
Right.
the first place that was drained.
Right. Yeah, because of the war.
Yeah.
The manner in which they displaced the people, however, was brutal and ruthless. So, in any event, I won't give you my personal opinions about some of that.
But I can imagine a culture that's been there for thousands of years, and these people know how to subsist because they live in the marshes. Suddenly the marsh is gone, And what do they have to live
Well,
with?
this is just in this strip. Now, the story continues after 1991. Now, 1991, early 1991, was the first Gulf War, the American and coalition forces invading Iraq the first time. And in the aftermath of that, the first President Bush called upon the people of Iraq to rise up in rebellion against Saddam. And it was the hope, obviously, of the United States that Saddam would be deposed. Well, the Shia of the South took him up on that and did rise up. The Badr Corps, which was an Iraqi military unit, opposition military unit that was trained and equipped by Iran, rolled across the border in the area around Basra. They attacked the Iraqi forces. The Marsh Arabs at that point had become disillusioned with Saddam, and even though they had fought for the most part with the Iraqi army during the Iran-Iraq War, now they rose up in rebellion against him, joined the rebellion, and Saddam's forces ruthlessly crushed that uprising, the 1991 uprising as it's sometimes called. And those who were involved in that uprising were disappointed to find that the United States did virtually nothing to stop that. In fact, even was the West was in denial about the extent and the scope of that repression and the retribution that followed in general. Many of the rebels fled into the marshes, and the Marsh Arabs, of course, returned to their homes in the marshes. But this was something, the marshes appear to have become an obsession, for one of Saddam's obsessions. It appears that that which he could not control, he destroyed. And he set about, even though after the Iran-Iraq War, the economy of Iraq was in shambles. The national debt was astronomical. He invested a huge portion of the remaining treasure of the country into a project of first militarily attacking the villages of the marshes and ultimately exercising the environmental equivalent of the nuclear option, so to speak, figuratively speaking, of draining the marshes. A huge engineering project at huge expense to drain the marshes, not just that strip, that buffer strip that initially had been done, but the marshes in general. And ultimately, villages were bombarded, they were attacked until the no-fly zone was established by helicopter gunships. Soldiers came in and destroyed the villages. Napalm was used in some instances to burn away after the marshes were drained. Sometimes the water was poisoned. Landmines were put in the water to prevent villagers from returning to their villages after being displaced, or to escape to Iran. Either way, they were caught out in the middle. And after the villages were, the area was drained, sometimes napalm was used to burn all of the brush and left the whole area a virtual wasteland.
Would you describe this as an attempt to wipe out the Marsh Arabs or just to drive them out of the marshes?
That's the subject of the investigation.
Okay. Now, I'd never thought about this before, but you hear so much about the Kurds and the gassing of the Kurdish villages and all the atrocities associated with the Kurds. How come you don't hear nearly as much about the Marsh Arabs?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't have all the answers to that. We really wouldn't hear much about the Marsh Arabs but for a woman by the name of Emma Nicholson.
Okay, and I think we've got a picture of Emma someplace, if we can go to that.
Emma Nicholson, in 1991, was a member of the British Parliament, the House of Commons. And
Baroness.
She wasn't a baroness at that time, but she was a noted humanitarian. But yes, this is the picture of her with a Marsh Arab woman. And Emma Nicholson kept hearing these reports about the plight of the Marsh Arabs. And being unable, people kept telling her, these people are just telling you stories to try to play upon your sympathies, to try to get resources. It's not really happening. The West was in denial. And this has been a fairly typical response to genocidal attacks throughout history in the West.
In denial because we can't begin to fathom that level of evil, or just because we don't want to face it, or?
Multiple reasons. Both of those, I think, would be included. But in any event, she decided to find out for herself. So she talked her way, basically solo, in 1991 into Tehran, in Iran. Mind you, this is in 1991, immediate, in the revolutionary sort of environment that existed at that time in Iran. She talked her way as a woman, alone, and a member of the British Parliament into Tehran, then talked her way down to the border with Iraq, and crossed the border into Iraq, which she told me caused quite some consternation among her Iranian handlers, who made her come back. But she did it again on a later date and went across with a guide and a film crew, and went out in one of those canoes like they use, and found the Marsh Arabs, made contact with them, and found them wandering in that wilderness, what was left of it.
By this time, it's nothing but a dusty desert.
Well, there were still areas. It took some time. This was in late 1991, and it wasn't until 94, 95, something like that, that the real full extent of the drainage was accomplished, where, by the way, there was probably only, I've heard, somewhere between 12-15% of the original marsh size that was left. It was still there, but she went up, she has described, both to me and in things that in her writings, being at one point lost and in a canoe and had to pull into the reeds to escape detection by the Iraqi soldiers, and being close enough during an artillery barrage to hear the Iraqi soldiers talking, and spent the night there. Just a remarkable woman. Yeah. She became, I call her the guardian angel of the Marsh Arabs. She's loved by the people. She set up a relief organization and relief efforts on the Iranian side of the border, where it was safe at that time, and did everything she could to bring the United Nations and the international community to a state of awareness of what was going on to the Marsh Arabs. The no-fly zone being imposed was, I think it's fair to say, in some measure attributable to her efforts to draw Western attention to that, to the plight of the Marsh Arabs.
It sounds like there must have been massive refugee camps in Iran and other countries that were absorbing these people. I just can't imagine tens and hundreds of thousands of these Marsh Arabs wandering around the desert now.
Well, I've seen the figure in reports that are public documents, that there are about 40,000 refugees, or were about 40,000 Marsh Arab refugees in refugee camps in Iran, but obviously that's only a small fraction of the total population. Some went to the big cities, but you can imagine people coming from that sort of environment into the big cities. What do?
Yeah.
Obviously...
Were they literate, you think, most of them?
Some, but that's a major problem. The lack of schools and literacy among the people, the lack of medical attention. This is all part of what now Baroness Emma Nicholson, member of the House of Lords and member of the European Parliament, has been trying to do, and others trying to do, to deliver education and medical assistance to the Marsh Arabs, to try to preserve the remnant of that civilization.
I've got a couple questions I hope I don't forget. One of the questions deals with, if you have a sense of the scale, are there numbers that have been discussed about how many might have perished in this? You know, it was even difficult to determine the population of the region before the war, but is there some sense of how many might have died because of the being displaced?
I grappled with that the whole time I was there. I don't know what the state of the investigation is at this point in time. I couldn't say if I was. I can say that that's a serious question. It's one that may be impossible to really adequately answer, because number one, you don't have a baseline to start with. Number two, the people were scattered. Where did they go? I do think that it is fair to say that my own personal opinion, and again, this is my own personal opinion, that we're talking about 100,000, 200,000 people who may have perished. That's easy to believe if you assume that there were 400,000 to begin with, and then you look at the number, the relatively few that can be accounted for now in the aftermath.
Okay. Well, and that kind of puts it into the same scale as what the Kurds suffered.
It is. It's huge. Now, the difference is the Kurds, you can establish through census information and all of that with much more accuracy the number of casualties.
Because of the nature of their subsistence economy and their lifestyle, well, that put the onus on you investigating it, didn't it? Try to track down the information.
Very much so.
I did want to ask if, it sounds like you met the Baroness.
Yes, several times.
And is she part of the evidence then? Is she going to be able to be a witness in this?
Well, she's a potential witness, as were news reporters, others who later came and interviewed people or were in villages, medical personnel who were there. There are potential witnesses. Now, those who is and who is not a witness, number one, it's up to the Iraqis to decide. Number two, I couldn't tell you anyway.
Okay.
But there are people who did come from the West and who did, including the Baroness, who were eyewitnesses to things that happened. Let's put it this way. Saddam Hussein knew Emma Nicholson by name, and she was a thorn in his side.
And he would have loved to get his hands on her.
Well, I can't comment on that, but he did some things to try to discredit her and to convince people that she was just somebody who was misguided, and no matter how well-intentioned, the things she was alleging were untrue and all. Well, now, of course, we know she was right.
Mm-hmm. Now, this might very well be another question that you can't answer, so don't hesitate to not answer if that's the case. But do you have some sense, what's your belief of the motives of Saddam and the Baathists to try to drain the marshes?
Well, beyond what I've said, I think that it probably would be inappropriate for me to comment on that. There's always the possibility that I'll be involved again at some point as the case goes to trial. I don't know that that's true, but that's a possibility. And but I'll comment to a certain extent on that. It's complicated, like everything in Iraq. I don't think there's one motive. I know that the regime said publicly that their reason for draining the marshes was that they wanted to create farmland. They wanted to reclaim this wetland and turn it into farmland. And
it didn't look like very good farmland to me.
Well, one would expect that if you were creating farmland, you'd have a concurrent, number one, if you're doing this for the good of the people, then you'd have some sort of program for caring for them while they're displaced, which was almost totally absent.
Or an irrigation system to replace it with.
Right. Nor would you move them out of their villages by bombarding them with artillery shells, mining the waters around them, and burning the villages, destroying them down to the bare earth. But the ground, the land is saline in nature. It's unsuitable, largely unsuitable for agricultural purposes. It worked wonderfully as a place for fish, rice, the sort of economy that they had. However, it remains a virtual barren wasteland right now. There are villages that are now on, I think we're looking at a Marsh Arab village right now that's on dry ground, and that's the way most of it is. Now, I believe in the next picture that we have, if you look at that, this village, this is a picture that was actually taken back in November of 2005. This is on the edge of that same village. There are some portions that are retaining the old ways. These are some, these could have been 3,500 years ago structures that were built by in time of the Sumerians.
So is this an example of attempts to restore the marshlands afterwards, after the occupation?
There were. I understand that the marshes, about 40% of the original marshes have been restored, and where the people, where some are able to, they're using the canoes, they're fishing, they're doing, some of the water buffalo have now been restored. But it is very difficult now to undo what had been done, because to some extent what happened, these levees were built up on each side of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and so it raised the water level. Well, if those levees were be broken, the whole area would flood. That's true. So what do you do with all the villages that are now on dry ground?
Yeah.
Iraq has got a lot of problems right now, and that's a huge humanitarian and social project that would be difficult to undertake at the present time. Plus, even if you were to restore the marshes, how do you bring back a culture? How do you, now once displaced, their homeland was destroyed, and their culture with it, their lifestyle, how do you bring them back now? You've just missed a large part of a generation.
But I got to believe even if you restored only a portion of it, there are Marsh Arabs that are being pulled back like a, they want to go back. They want to resettle.
You're absolutely true, and I had the opportunity to meet a number of them from their villages. Again, the villages are for the most part on dry ground now, but I think that will change. There's a natural tendency among any people, any culture, to try to preserve their culture. And I think that there are those among the Marsh Arabs who want to do that. I don't know how long it'll take before we find out to what extent that's going to be possible, but definitely the Marsh Arabs have not been absorbed completely into the rest of the Iraqi population. They still maintain, many of them at least, their unique cultural and ethnic identity as an ethnic group.
Okay. What I wanted to do then is to have you spend a little bit of time talking about exactly how you went about the process of investigating this, because as you're describing it, these aren't the kind of people who leave careful records, and you're one person investigating a crime a potential crime, an alleged crime that covers 400,000 people and tens of thousands of square miles. So how do you do that?
Well, the Marsh Arabs didn't keep careful records, but the Iraqi government and military did. As was found right now they're just finishing up, as we're talking here, the second trial, the trial involving the Kurds of the north of the first of those trials, the Anfal case, as it's called. And the evidence in that case consists largely of a huge number of documents that were seized by the Kurdish rebels, the Peshmerga, and turned over to Human Rights Watch, and from Human Rights Watch turned over to investigating authorities. And those records demonstrate that the Iraqi military and political officers kept careful records of virtually everything they did. Now, the same would be true with the Marsh Arabs of the South. The problem is that during the invasion, little care or attention was given initially at the time of the invasion itself to securing the locations where those records were kept. It's understandable under the circumstances. They weren't even securing munitions.
Which isn't necessarily
locations.
Understandable.
But, and that's posing a problem these days. But documents and things of that sort were unsecured. There was widespread looting. Many of the documents were lost, but huge amounts of documents from around the country were seized. In many instances, in fact, I'd say probably most, there was little documentation as to where the documents had been seized from, other than from, you could tell by the documents that they were in company of. They'd be in boxes or something like that. Those were taken outside the country to a safer, a more secure location, and huge crews went through those. Teams of translators looking initially for evidence of weapons of mass destruction, but then going through, making another pass, looking for other evidence of other things, including evidence of that would support the investigations or that would relate to the investigations being conducted by the Iraqi High Tribunal. So a big part of the investigation was identifying, communicating to the people doing that review of these tons and tons and tons of documents, what we were looking for. They needed to be educated so that when they saw it, they'd recognize, aha, this relates to the IHT's investigations, and funnel them to us, and then to review those documents. The other thing was to try to talk to the Marsh Arabs themselves, the survivors. And that was challenging because of the security or insecurity environment.
Now, did you have to travel to that region to find them, or did you talk to Marsh Arabs that had been displaced to the Baghdad area, or both?
Well, the judge made a number of trips on his own. He didn't wait for us. He was very proactive. And so he and his investigators had made trips and conducted interviews, took videotapes, did things of that sort. Now, we, however, based on interviews by relief organizations with people who had survived, were able to identify a large number of people who had made statements before to these folks in 1991, 1992, and all that had come in to try to assist them. We tried to identify those people or people like them and bring them to a central location, a safe location. And we used Basra Air Station, which was the air base. It had been Basra International Airport, and it was controlled at that point by the British, and so it was a safe location. We'd bring witnesses in there, talk to them, and the judge and his investigators would talk to them.
Now, you said you were the only investigator from the Regime Crimes Liaison Office, but there are obviously several or a lot of Iraqi investigators working on this as well?
Yes. There's the Iraqi High Tribunal has a number, 12, 15 investigators. They're like an investigator pool, but some of them are assigned to concentrate on particular investigations.
So it's not so much you doing the investigation, but advising and working with the Iraqi investigators, or a little of both?
Right. I was trying to learn Arabic, but only enough to create a sense of comedy for the Iraqis when I would try to speak it. I'm still trying to learn Arabic and made a lot more progress, but these interviews had to be conducted in Arabic, the language that the witnesses spoke. And so FBI agents would train investigators on how to conduct interviews and the types of things that we felt they would need to learn as we anticipate a trial. The Iraqis in their system did not have a lot of experience with complex cases. We, the FBI agents that I worked with, myself, I was an advisor, an attorney advisor. There were FBI agents, agents from the FBI, and had DEA also, and ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, that I worked with. They would train, and then the Iraqi investigators and the judge would conduct the interviews. Sometimes the Americans would sit in, kind of observing, using a translator so that they could hear what's being said, so they were aware of what was going on. But again, it was the Iraqis from the Iraqi High Tribunal conducting the actual investigation.
Were all of the interviews done with victims, or were there interviews done with people who are identified as being involved with the alleged crimes in the first place?
Both. There were people that had been obviously the trials, the two trials that have been held so far, are examples of the procedures that were used, where people everywhere from Saddam Hussein, Chemical Ali, and others were captured. Interviews were conducted. They made statements to Iraqi investigative judges, and those statements have been read into evidence. And so the detainees, efforts were made to interview them, get their version of things. They would have attorneys with them during those proceedings. Those were judicial proceedings conducted by the Iraqi judges and investigators. They would have their attorney present, and those interviews may lead to other follow-up interviews to people that they directed us to, or the other investigation that those interviews suggested needed to be conducted. So there were a lot of different avenues of investigation. Our job was to try to support the IHT judges and investigators in whatever way they needed to get them from where they were, sometimes just the logistics of getting them to the place
Yeah.
where they could conduct the interviews, get the witnesses to them, sometimes collect them or facilitate that, secure the evidence, handle evidence, funnel documents to them.
Would there be interviews with people like engineers who had designed the dike system, or soldiers who had participated in attacks on villages?
Anyone and everyone that we could find, that we could identify.
Okay. Now here's
Yes.
my next unfair question for you, but having spent a lot of time talking to American military police officers and enlisted men who had worked with the Iraqi police, sometimes it was a difficult thing for the Iraqis to understand our interrogation techniques for somebody you thought was on the wrong side of the law, perhaps. Was that an issue or a problem with your investigators?
Not really. They were, I think we were lucky. We had some of the best of the best.
These
I
were
worked
people
with.
who were primarily legally trained?
And Judge Muhammad was very, very capable and competent as an interviewer. His lead investigator, the two of them worked very well together in conducting interviews. Just to give you an example, there were some very reprehensible people that were interviewed in the course of these proceedings. Judge Muhammad, I know in one instance, would start off the first day very low-key, didn't even wear his robe, and would talk about how, oh, I've always admired you, you've been such a great asset to our country and all of this, and it's so unfortunate to see you under these circumstances, things to that effect. Develop a relationship. Now, this wasn't how he really felt, but it broke the ice, established a relationship in which a conversation began.
Yeah.
His investigator would conduct the interview the first day and be writing things down, very low-key and friendly. The second day, he'd put on the robe, and he would go over some of the same ground, but by this time, he'd established a relationship. Now, these are techniques that are designed to get a person talking, feel free about talking, and an attempt to get to the bottom of things and to set aside his own personal distaste and pass up the opportunity to use this as just a grandstanding moment or something of that sort. He was very professional, he was very competent, so was his lead investigator, and we really enjoyed working with them and had a great deal of admiration for them. He also insisted that he wanted these to be videotaped. Now, this is something that's an innovation in their system. Actually, is becoming something of an innovation and somewhat
in our system,
somewhat controversial in ours.
Yeah.
But he was insisting that they be that those videotapes be made. Now, the videotape could not be as evidence, but he said, what if later on they say, "Oh, I didn't sign that. That wasn't me. It's on videotape."
or I was coerced into making
I
that
was
statement.
coerced into making the statement. Or the person said, "No, I didn't read the document I signed carefully enough. That's not what I said." Well, let's watch the tape.
Now, when these kinds of individuals were being interviewed, interrogated, however you want to call it, did they have a defense attorney, or did they have somebody there representing them? Or
Yes, the detainee would have a defense attorney there.
okay,
We were very careful about making sure that that was always the case.
And
Sometimes
who's-
more than one.
who selected them? How did they get chosen?
Well, they either hired them themselves or the court appointed one. Now, the Iraqi High Tribunal had a defense chamber. There were prosecutors, but there were also defense attorneys.
Mm-hmm.
And the defense attorneys would be much like our public defenders, who would be assigned to represent a particular detainee and be present if the detainee did not have an attorney of their own.
Would they be forced to testify? Did they have anything similar to the Fifth, where they didn't have to testify against themselves?
Absolutely. The latter. They were advised of their rights before any interview. They'd be told they had a right to remain silent. It wasn't exactly our Miranda rights, but it was essentially the same thing.
And this is part of their new constitution that had
No.
been adopted.
This was their standard
Okay.
criminal procedure. This
Okay.
is the way they were used to doing business. And they would revert back to what they were familiar with, rather than adopt our foreign procedures. And their procedures that they were used to were very much in parallel to ours in this respect.
How often did you have an opportunity to travel down to the Marsh region?
Well, several times.
Did you spend long periods of time down there?
I made several trips down there. On one trip, we stayed down there for a week, another for 2 weeks. Other trips were sometimes in and out of that area. I had the opportunity to fly over the entire Marsh area on 2 occasions in British helicopters. And
what used to be the Marsh area?
Yes. We'd see both some areas that were restored and some areas, and that's where pictures that you've seen were taken, and then some areas that were still just barren.
Yeah.
They look like you were in a barren area in South Texas or something like that. And instead of water buffalo, you sometimes see sheep herders.
Could you tell, though, that it used to be a marshy area, or is that not obvious, at least to your way of looking at it?
Well, I'm sure an expert could, and in some areas you could see that it had been cultivated, that it was probably areas where rice had been grown or something like that. In some areas you'd see what used to be date palm areas, but now they look like there's been a forest fire go through there. They're just burnt stubble. But I'm told by the experts, we talked to a number of them, and they have written about it, that as Baroness Nicholson once put it to me, she said she's been told, she's been involved in this a great deal, that the marshes are still there, or they're still alive. They're just covered with dry dirt. And that as it refloods, they come back to life.
Yeah.
So the experts are able to see things that I couldn't, particularly from a helicopter.
Was that an emotional experience flying over that?
Oh,
And
yes.
knowing the background of it?
I had books that showed pictures. I have, for example, of the village, Al-Kabab, a storied village, a beautiful village, and then to fly over the same village location and see it's just flat and desolate, but you could see the platforms where the village had once been, and there's nothing there.
Yeah.
There's nothing there. And to think that for thousands of years, people had lived there, and now they're gone. They're gone. They're either dead or they're gone someplace else, but the culture is gone.
We're going to spend next time, I think that'll be our last time together, talking about the nature of the trial itself. But I wanted to finish off today with maybe some of your personal recollections or stories about the Marsh Arabs in particular. And I know we've got a couple pictures that we can look at in that respect as well. But I certainly wanted to get that aspect of it as well, that these are real people and some of the personal experiences that you've had.
Well, there were some interesting people that I met and was able to get pictures of, some interesting faces that we saw. Okay,
there's one of the faces. That's a face that speaks volumes.
That face just had to be photographed when I saw him. Very friendly people, very hospitable, very gracious. They're just an easy people to love. One day I had an opportunity to meet a group of women who were wearing their traditional clothing, dark clothing that was like a robe.
Yeah, I guess we're looking at a picture of that now. Is that the...
Yes, it is.
It's not really a burqa, is it, or?
No, it's less covering than that, but it's traditional Muslim dress. But this one young woman, toward the end of the day, we'd been together most of the day, and toward the end of the day, she opened up her robe, and there was this little baby.
So that's what we're looking at now?
That's what we're looking at there. And that little baby had been there the whole day, and we had no idea. And she was a proud mother and was showing it to me before they left, and I got that picture.
I can't imagine an American baby being quiet the entire day like that.
No, but in that you also saw in that picture a woman behind her who was older.
We can get the picture back again, maybe.
Well, you see some makeup there, and that makeup is tattooed on over the eyes and then under the chin.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it a lot easier in the mornings, I'm sure, to take care of the makeup when it's tattooed. This is a picture of the young woman, and I think we have a picture there of the older woman with the makeup. Maybe not.
I didn't include that one. I'm sorry.
Okay, but in any event, I understand that's done by pricking the skin and then rubbing in charcoal. But those were some of the characteristics of this culture, the ethnic group of the Marsh Arabs. Now, I do have to tell you, if we have time, about one of the sheikhs, a tribal chief who was speaking to me through a translator.
And let's go ahead and finish with that then.
He asked me, what tribe are you from? And I said, well, in our country, we don't really have tribes. And he said, no tribes. Do you have a family? I said, well, yes, I do. In fact, I have a fairly large family. My wife and I have 7 children. We have 10 grandchildren. And we have another on the way now, by the way, but 10 at that time. And we sometimes, in my extended family, we get together for family reunions. And he said, that's a tribe. And then he said, well, tell me, when you have a dispute between 2 people in your country, how do you resolve that? Do you go to the government? And I said, well, I guess we usually do. If it's over money, we go to a judge. If it's a dispute, if it's a crime, we go to the police. He goes, oh. Well, here, we only go to the police if it's a serious crime, like a murder. Otherwise, the sheikh solves the problem. And I said, well, that may be one of the reasons why your culture and civilization have lasted for thousands of years. I wonder whether our litigious society of these days could exist unchanged for that time. We view them as a primitive people, and yet I believe, and I found, that there are aspects to their culture from which we could learn a great deal. And they deserve our respect, and to the extent that it's possible, the real evil of genocide is not just the mass scale of the number of people who are killed.
Mm-hmm.
It's the loss to humanity, to the rest of us, of all that culture would have added to the richness of our human existence. In a real sense, the victims are not just those who are killed, but those of us who survive. And I hope we can save as much as possible of the Marsh Arabs as an ethnic group and as a culture.
And obviously, the opportunity that you had to investigate those crimes and perhaps in some small way help restore that culture is something that you take great pride in.
Well, great satisfaction.
Well, I think that's probably a very good point to end today's session, and we should have some very interesting discussions talking about the trial probably in about a week from now. But David, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's fascinating.
Humanity to the rest of us.